She stood at the edge of the training range with a calm that did not match the thudding of her heart, not because she doubted her skill, but because she had watched the men who had tried before her, brilliant marksmen one and all, falter under the pressure of a challenge that read more like an ordeal than an exercise. The signboard above the berm had only 3 words stamped in block letters: one shot, many, and the whispered rumor among the unit was that, over the last year, no one had managed to string more than a handful of consecutive hits. The wind in that canyon had a way of bending even the most disciplined shot. Heat shimmer rippled the mirage lines, and something about the geometry of the targets staggered. Partially obscured by natural cover, moving subtly on a rail to mimic real-world unpredictability, made the simple act of hitting the ringed bullseye repeatedly into a test of patience and imagination, rather than merely marksmanship. She had grown up with rifles in her life the way others grew up with lullabies. Her father, a hunter who taught her to read the land and respect the silence between breaths. Afternoons in a field where targets were tin cans and scores were kept by laughter. The first time she pocketed a rabbit and realized that precision carried consequence and responsibility in equal measure. The military had taught her the rest: how to factor wind down to half degrees, how to inhale and slow the tremor of muscle into a still point, how to live inside the gap between a sight settling and the crack that answers it. But this test was not only about kinetic calculations. It demanded a kind of focus that erased the presence of others. It required the shooter to stand alone under the relentless sun and, shot after shot, make a small, private agreement with the world that the next click, the next tiny violence, would be the one to make order out of chaos. When the range master asked, with a tone that balanced curiosity and indulgent skepticism, "Can I borrow your rifle for a second?" he meant it as a diagnostic. He had seen the way her shoulders stayed loose, the way her fingers never fumbled on the bolt, and the way men tried to replicate a rhythm she had made her own and failed. He wanted to see whether the gun itself might be the variable, whether swapping rifles might change the outcome. She handed it to him the way you hand over a living thing, deliberately, with trust and with a faint smile that said, "I am not superstitious, but I am not foolish either." The rifle had been modified with a stock that fit the length of her arm like an exhalation fits an inhale. The bedding had been adjusted by a gunsmith who sawed and sanded and eyed the free recoil until it felt less a mechanical event and more an extension of her will. It had a scope whose reticle she had learned to read like a friend reads intent, and the grip carried the oil and polish of familiarity. The instructor wrenched the action closed, cycled around through, and fired. The group of snipers watching, a small fraternity hardened by years of nights in ghillie suits and maps that smelled faintly of coffee and sand, leaned forward with the kind of attention usually reserved for briefings and funerals. The first round struck cleanly, but the second, and the third, and the fourth, the rhythm broke. He adjusted, he cursed softly. He swore he felt a wobble. He replaced the magazine. On the 5th volley, where the targets were supposed to be a disciplined procession of geometry, there were tiny misses, shots that kissed the outer ring like a distracted lover. He handed the rifle back with a shrug that tried to hide a spark of respect. "It's a fine rifle, but it's not the gun. It's the shooter." She tightened her scarf, felt the grit of the range under her boots, and stepped back into position. The first shot fell exactly where she meant it, a center hit that sounded like an affirmation, the kind of small thunder that makes your breath slow. The second followed, then the third. The little beads of impact marched across the targets like punctuation in a sentence that suddenly made sense. Men murmured. A captain who had been politely amused by the rumor of an unbroken string of strikes straightened his posture as if he were watching a plane hold steady in turbulence. They called the count aloud at first, tentative, and then with growing disbelief. 10, 20, 30. She did not hear them after a while. She heard only the metronome of her own preparation. Exhale, find the axis, touch the trigger. A tiny separation between intention and action, where the world narrowed to a single point of aim, and an unnegotiable trust that the physics she had learned, and the muscle memory she had called into being, would honor her request. The sun watched like an impartial judge, throwing no favors, and the wind of fickle and mischievous, teased tiny adjustments out of her pellets that she countered without thought. Someone later would say she entered a state like meditation, or that she became a machine. She would insist later that she had simply given the moment the attention it deserved and nothing more. On the 50th shot a gust lifted off the canyon and tried to unseat her concentration. She felt it across the cheek weld of the stock, a cool nudge that could have sent her round to the margins. Instead, she waited it out, counted the beat of the gust like a conductor counts before a downbeat, and fired on the crest of stillness. 60, 70, the tally climbed. Men took baits in whispers and then stopped themselves, as if to mar a holiness with arithmetic. Her unit's chief sniper, a taciturn man with a face like a map of hard decisions, stood with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched until he released a sound that was almost a laugh, equal parts relief and astonishment. People like to say luck chooses when it will be kind. What they don't say is that luck is also a fickle observer, and that it honors preparation the way a strict teacher honors attendance. Every hit was a conversation between her and the rifle, one that had been rehearsed for years in kitchens and fields and the private mirror of practice. Each impact affirmed the tiny adjustments she made without thought, a half-twist of the wrist to compensate for a micro-wind, a breath held a second longer because her pulse promised a tremor otherwise, a pinch of finger pressure that translated into a whisper on the trigger. By the time she reached 100, the crowd had gathered like a small, reverent audience at a play. They did not want to applaud too loudly for fear of breaking the spell. Children of soldiers, mess hall cooks who had wandered over with dish towels on their shoulders, and a few hardened veterans who rarely smiled at anything stood in the shade and watched the line of black holes populate the paper ring after ring. Her commanding officer stepped forward, not with ceremony, but with an almost embarrassed necessity, and asked, "How do you do it?" She thought of the long nights of dry fire practice, of the leather-bound notebook where she had sketched wind charts and notes about Kant and environmental mischief like a scientist making scribbles for a future experiment. She thought of mornings when she would wake before dawn to train until her hands ached, not to impress anyone, but because mastery had become, in a way, its own companion. Steady, demanding, unsentimental, she gave him a small, tired smile. "I stop measuring the distance to the target," she said, "and start measuring the distance between breaths." The next 50 went by like a blur of tiny explosions and steady resolve. Her cheek tingled with the repetition of the stock, the muzzle rose and settled, and the rifle answered with a faithful cadence. Each shot a small bell in a temple where focus had become prayer. People began to count for her now. Not because she needed the numbers, but because standing outside of her loop, the count made the accomplishment legible to everyone else. 150. The announcer's voice cracked when the number hit. Later he would say he lost the professional in him for a moment and sounded like a child who had discovered a secret. The targets, once a scatter of possible failure, now resembled a neat constellation of victory. When the last bullet finished its short arc and the last ring flared with an impact, there was a silence that tasted like the space after a storm clears. Empty and full all at once. No one rushed her. There were protocols about rechecks, about verifying rounds. Someone had to log the event. Someone wanted to know what load she had used, what scope setting, what environmental variables had aligned to produce the impossible. She followed the motions, signed the sheets, handed the rifle to be checked, allowed technicians to measure the barrel and the bedding as if the rifle might have secretly altered its own properties. The instrument said nothing mystical. The gun was sound. The logbook recorded the fact and the date and the time. Later, the base magazine ran an article, dry, official, with quotes from the training sergeant and the commander, but none of that described the sensation of standing in the middle of a field while a rumor became truth and then, like a phoenix, settled back into the ordinary day-to-day with only the soft burn of memory to prove it had ever happened. She tried to explain it in the small ways people explain things that are too big to fit into sentences, that it had been a confluence of habit and concentration, a letting go of the edges of fear so that only the necessary remained. Rumors swelled, as they do. Some called it luck. Others called it witchcraft. A few, more practical, credited equipment or the possibility that the targets had been tampered with. She let them talk. The truth, which she kept to herself like a private name, was narrower and more generous. She had trained to do one thing, over and over, until the act was less of a performance and more of an extension of everything that had shaped her, the hunting lessons of childhood. The discipline of the unit, the quiet insistence of mornings when she chose the practice mat over sleep. To hit one target is to be good. To hit 50 in a row is to be steady. To hit 150 is to have summoned a patience that outlasted the weather and the doubts of men who loved their guns and thereby believed in the legend of a particular kind of masculinity. She refused to let their surprise become her currency. Instead, she kept the achievement like a stone in her pocket, small, weighty, ordinary, and walked back to the barracks as if nothing had changed except the way the sun now seemed to sit a degree higher in the sky. As if the world had shifted just enough to let her see the long road she had walked mirrored in a strip of paper perforated with holes. That night, in the quiet place where soldiers are allowed to be private and flawed, they raised a toast, not to superstition but to competence. They told the story with the embellishment soldiers love. The wind that tried to steal the shot, the instructor's borrowed rifle, the hush that fell as each ring darkened. She listened and laughed when appropriate, corrected nothing and invented nothing. The record would sit in a file, the photographs would be used in recruitment brochures and in an article that would skewer the spectacle into a lesson about training. But to her it remained a moment that, though visible to many, belonged to the narrow corridor of things one can only feel, the small, steady machine of breath, the soft click of the trigger release, the way a sequence of ordinary acts can, when combined, shape the extraordinary.